Hey everyone, I just wanted to put out a video going over my early thoughts on the Path of Exile 2 early access so far, and then a little overview of my first character toward the end. This is actually only the first PoE2 video I've made so far. I originally planned to put out a video after finishing the campaign for the first time, but at that point I had mixed feelings about the game, and decided to give it some time rather than post my knee-jerk reactions. To preface this video, I have over 8,000 hours played in Path of Exile 1, I've been excited for PoE2 since it was announced, and I've agreed with nearly every decision GGG has said that they were making with PoE2 since it was announced. I've even been in favor of some of their more unpopular decisions, like the Harvest rework in PoE1. That said, most of my thoughts in this video are probably going to be criticisms, not because I'm not enjoying the game, but because those criticisms just stand out more. One other thing I want to mention is that I haven't really been watching or following content from any PoE2 creators yet, just because I want to present thoughts that are genuinely my own. I do peek in at streams occasionally just to get a pulse on what classes and skills other players are using, but that's about it. That also means, however, that everything I say in this video could have already been said by someone else, and better, and I would have no idea. So hopefully I don't end up sounding like I'm just repeating the common sentiments on the game. So I'm just going to get right into the things that I found frustrating or felt need to be changed. These aren't in any particular order. For the most part, they're just in the order that I encountered them, with some exceptions that I grouped together. If I think one of these things is more important and deserves special attention, then I'll mention that when I go over it. This one I'm going to mention first, though, because I think it is among the most important, at least to me. I was really disappointed when I found out that there would not be UI hot swapping between controller and mouse and keyboard at the start of early access. I know this is coming before you say anything, but I really hoped it would be higher on their priority list than many of the things that did make it in. In some of the early developer interviews posted on YouTube, I remember when they were asked how controller support would work, they said something to the effect of, when you pick up the controller, it just starts working. Isn't that all it needs? And I was screaming internally because the correct answer to that question is no, that isn't all it needs. It needs to present a UI that is properly functional with the input device in question. The controller UI hot swap in Diablo 2 Resurrected is incredible and single-handedly responsible for keeping me playing that game after more than 2 decades. Please look to that example as the industry standard. In the gem cutting menu, we need an option to filter by gems that we currently have equipped. It can be tedious upgrading your existing gems if they are spread across several categories of gems and you don't remember all their names. The visibility of the item tooltip that shows prefixes and suffixes needs to be addressed. I usually hang out in Discord with a group of 3 to 5 other PoE1 vets while playing. On launch there were 4 of us playing, and every single one of us thought that there was no way to tell if an item mod was a prefix or a suffix until we were all well into endgame when one of us noticed the tooltip that was so subtle it was practically invisible. That's it right there in case you were curious. Speaking of visibility, let's talk about monsters. Monsters are very easy to distinguish in PoE1 at a glance. You can just look at the screen and tell that these ones with a blue aura are magic, just like magic items are blue, and a yellow aura means rare, same as items. In PoE2, it is utterly impossible to tell which monsters have special rarities without cursoring over every one of them, and by then you might be dead already, because rare monsters in this game can be many times deadlier than normal monsters. On the subject of monster visibility, let's talk about something that also affects PoE1 after it was backported from this game. The boss health bars are a cool idea, but I've never liked how they're implemented, even in PoE1. First of all, they are huge and obscure a big chunk of the screen, but you might not actually realize how much field of view real estate they take up until you consider the camera angle of the game. Because of the isometric view, we can see a lot more toward the top of the screen than the bottom. This can be demonstrated pretty easily with this image showing distance measurements in PoE1. See how many more rings fit in the image near the top? What this means is that any UI element at the top of the screen obstructs the view a lot more than anything at the bottom, and this gets exacerbated when that UI element is as huge as the boss health bars. On my first run through the campaign, I felt like several of my deaths to the Act 2 boss were just due to not being able to properly see the fight behind the UI. I was planning on talking about this one later in the video, but let's keep the visibility train rolling. This time it's about quests. Remember that group of PoE1 vets that I mentioned that I game with? Not one of us could tell the difference between a completed quest and an uncompleted quest on the map our first time through. Of course, now that I've played through the game several times, I can tell them apart without issue, but that should be something that is easy for a first-time player to see. No one is going to remember the names of every quest they've finished and every boss they've slain, especially on their first playthrough. The quest icons on the map are all kind of gray or off-white, and just turn a slightly darker gray when the quest is completed. Can't this be a little more distinct? The final visibility issue I want to mention has to do with the UI for charms. There is no way at all to tell if your charm has enough charges to actually work and save you from the thing you need it to save you from, unless you cursor over it and manually check. Just give it a little meter so we can tell if it's ready, like the utility flasks that they were already based on. Now, here's something that I know others have talked about already: on-death effects. I have heard the arguments for their inclusion and can understand where GGG is coming from with these. They want these to be something that forces you to properly think about your positioning during a fight. However, I think that argument falls apart quickly for 4 reasons. The first reason is that these effects last way too long, often longer than the entire fight lasts in such a fast-paced game. Second is that these effects are often on the toughest monsters in the pack to kill, meaning if they are dead, then the fight is over anyway. Third is that literally any threatening attack can make you think about your positioning, so why does it have to be an on-death effect? Fourth, and most importantly, is that they are just boring. No one is ever going to be excited that they finally remembered to wait for the big guy carrying the log to explode before moving on, but they are going to be frequently annoyed that they were forced to, and even more annoyed when they inevitably forget. If the argument is that they need a way to deal damage to players who clear monsters too fast, then just make some monsters with a limited form of invincibility to guarantee they get 1 or 2 swings off. Oh wait, they already did that. So why are we still here? I want to quickly interject some positivity in the middle of all this complaining. The campaign and the bosses in this game are fantastic. I've made several characters already just to experience those things again in a different way, but that will eventually lose its luster, which is why it is so important that they improve on the endgame. Also, I love the expanded story we got for Alva and the Val. I immediately started coming up with lore theories, which at this point I'm confident enough in that I'm certain other creators have come up with the same ideas and dissected them in greater detail than I ever will. But basically, the Alva we met in PoE1 is from further in the future than the Alva in PoE2. Alva in PoE1 is an experienced time traveler who seems to be able to use that power at will, while Alva in PoE2 is just being introduced to the concept of time travel, and also she just sounds younger. When we go back in time to Val civilization, everyone seems to be really upset about Alva being there, and then Doriani for some reason calls us the Demon of Atsuatl. So it seems that the Val are already well aware of future Alva's incursions to the past, and the ransacking of Atsuatl happened further in the past than this, but these Val don't realize that this isn't the same Alva, or at least not yet. Doriani is just mistaken in his accusation. The Val see a powerful warrior tagging along with Alva and assume it must be the Demon of Atsuatl. But the true Demon of Atsuatl is the exile from PoE1. Like I said, I don't think I'm breaking any new ground with these theories, but I still think it's an interesting way to tie the lore of the 2 games together and help us better understand what happened to the Val. We also get a quick glimpse at how Viper Napuatsi ends up in the Domain of Timeless Conflict from Legion in PoE1. I originally had a note written down about how bad the item scarcity in the game felt, but I think that the buff to Exalted Orb drop rates have helped a lot with that, and I also think I was just very unlucky on my first playthrough. My first character never found a single unique item until I was in endgame, and I didn't have a point of comparison to know if that was normal or not. Most of my friends also only found 1 or 2, and the uniques that we did find were all unusable trash. It's also just baffling how many uniques are as bad as they are after we heard GGG say that they wanted every unique to have a build around use case in endgame. I wouldn't even use most of these as kindling for fear that they would stink up the place. Also, the Waystone drop rate in early endgame felt very feast or famine. At first I had way more Waystones than I needed, but around the time I hit around tier 9 or 10 progress, I had to go all the way back down to tier 3s before I found enough Waystones to continue on. But luckily, this only happened once, and I've been sustaining Waystones ever since. When this happened, though, I had spec'd every available Atlas point into Waystone drops and upgrades, so that felt really bad. Something I just want to touch on here, because I'll go into it more when I talk about my first character, is that unreliability in ARPGs always sucks. People will always prefer something that works in every situation and will toss anything unreliable to the wayside, where it might get picked up by someone else for some very specific niche. Just look at the prices of items in PoE1 that generate charges on kill versus the ones that generate charges on hit for all the proof you need of this. What I'm getting at is that there are a lot of skills in PoE2 that do basically nothing unless you meet some very unlikely condition for them to work properly, and they all feel terrible to use. I'll go into more specifics later, but if you've experimented with a variety of skills in PoE2, then you've surely already encountered this, and just to be clear, it's fine for quirky niche skills to exist, but there needs to be more variety in things that are actually reliable. And maybe that will come when they add more weapon types to the game, I don't know. Moving on, the weapon set passives need a tutorial. They are easy to understand once you know how they work, but getting to that point is not intuitive at all. I don't really have anything else to say on this one, they just need a tutorial in-game. This one needs a little more context, but for a really long time in PoE1, it was always very tedious to get new gear because it meant that you would probably have to fix your resistances, and buying one piece of gear could instead turn into shopping for 3 or 4 pieces of gear, and that was even with the ability to change crafted resists on gear into something else. Eventually, we were given the harvest bench in our hideouts with the ability to swap any resist on any non-unique piece of gear to the same tier of a different resist. In my opinion, that was one of the best changes they ever made, because it cut down on the amount of time you had to waste fiddling with gear before you got back to actually playing the game. And now, not only can we not swap resists on gear, we can't even change the crafted resist that has been added to the gear, even if someone else put the rune in the item before selling it. And the resists we can get from runes are way lower than the crafts we had in PoE1. At the end of the day, this just means we have to waste a lot more time fixing our gear every time we want to make one little change. Now this one I maybe should have mentioned earlier because I think it's the most important thing in this whole list, but this also requires the most context and is specific to the endgame, so I left it towards the end. Despite Path of Exile being one of my favorite games ever and putting over 8,000 hours into it, there was a time back around the 2,000 hour mark when I quit playing the game altogether and decided not to come back until significant changes were made. This was back when the endgame revolved around chasing down the 4 Elder Slayers so you could face off against Cirrus. This took about an entire evening of mapping, and then when you finally got to Cirrus, your fight probably got bricked, either by a bug where the deatomization storms were invisible, or a bug where the storms blocked your only path and wouldn't move, or a bug where his audio cues for basically instant death attacks were mistimed and didn't play until after the attack, or a bug where he shot lasers out of his arse instead of his hands. All of those were real, by the way, which is why I will continue to laugh in the face of anyone who tries to claim that Cirrus was a well-designed boss fight. Design is nothing without implementation. You were supposed to have 6 attempts at that fight, but the reality was more like you had 1, because if you died and tried to re-enter the fight, then any of these bugs became much more likely to appear, and then you had to start all over. The drops from Cirrus could be extremely valuable at the time, so you just spent your entire evening getting to him, and then you found out that you wasted your time. And it was one of the most deflating feelings I've ever felt from a video game. All that is to say that the PoE2 endgame has the same problem, but worse. But to be fair, at least it isn't because of a bug or several this time. It took me about a week of playing the endgame to find a single citadel. I found a second one right next to it, but didn't even notice it for days because the Atlas navigation is so bare bones, and then I haven't found another one since, and it's been 2 weeks since then, of which you need 4 to face the endgame boss. So I attempted it, reached the boss, got one-shotted, and was no longer allowed to attempt the Citadel again. And that was the point when I realized I don't particularly care for the current endgame model. If there is only one piece of criticism that I get across in this entire video, it is this. One-shots and one attempt only are fundamentally incompatible in game design. I can't think of a single game ever that combines both unless it was intentionally designed to be frustrating as a joke, or an old arcade game designed to eat quarters. One of them has to go, either the one-shots or the one-attempt-only philosophy. I don't know which one would be better to remove, but I know it would be a lot easier to remove the one-attempt-only limit. The definition of a one-shot varies wildly to different characters, and trying to remove one-shots in a meaningful way seems like an impossible balance to achieve. On the other hand, maybe they should try anyway. I know they specifically mentioned that they looked to other action games like the Soul series and Elden Ring as examples of good action games with meaningful combat, but here's the thing, as unforgiving as those games are, even they don't really have one-shots. The first boss in Elden Ring is designed to be impossible for a first-time player, but still doesn't normally one-shot you unless you pick the weakest class with no armor. Even the slowest attack of the final boss in the Elden Ring DLC, the hardest boss in a modern FromSoft game, bar none, is specifically coded to never one-shot you, but always two-shot you. I'm not showing footage of that here because I know lots of people still haven't played it and don't want to be spoiled. One-shots will always be boring, especially in a game with levels as big as the maps in PoE2. And that's the perfect segue to move on from this into my next criticism. The maps in PoE2 are too damn big, and we are expected to track down every single rare monster on every map. The rare monster radar as it exists currently needs to start tracking them from the very beginning of the map, so we aren't wasting several minutes walking back across an empty map to find the one monster we missed at the beginning. Another complaint I've heard from the other players in my group is that map bosses are far too rare and they are the fun part of the game, and that made me realize that there is an easy solution to both of these issues. Put a boss in every map and give players the choice of either defeating the boss or defeating every rare. This still allows non-bossing builds to be viable, while also giving the option to just defeat a boss when you reach the end of the map, instead of backtracking across the whole thing, and you wouldn't even have to make the map smaller anymore. Now, to really drive this point home, I recorded a clip of this exact problem happening to me at the end of a linear map because I wanted to see exactly how long it would take to backtrack and find the one rare monster that I missed. And so, I present that clip to you unedited and with no voiceover because I want it to be exactly as boring as it was for me. That really is the crux of all of my issues with the game. Frustrations can be overcome, but boredom makes me not care about overcoming those frustrations. And right now, the endgame is boring for many reasons. Now that I've gone over my frustrations with the game, I'm just going to go over some bugs that I've encountered, or at the very least, if they aren't bugs, then I think they are oversights. I don't know if this is just me or if this is something missing from early access, but Una's songs seemingly just don't work at all, regardless of sound settings. This one seems to be inconsistent, and I don't know how to replicate the issue, but sometimes there is no attribute warning when you are respecking attribute points. I think that it may be failing to check certain gems, possibly only support gems. The level requirement for the time of need spirit gem is displayed incorrectly in the gemcutting menu. When you use a level 8 or 9 spirit gem, it for some reason displays the required character level for a level 10 time of need, but still makes the correct gem if you engrave it anyway. I don't currently have any level 8 or 9 spirit gems to demonstrate this. I did, but then I forgot to hit record when I tried to record footage of this. The literal first recommended support gem for Wind Blast is not actually compatible with the skill. I have seen and heard of some other skill gems that this is true for as well, but don't remember which skills those are. I think one may have been Vine Arrow. Some map connections on the endgame atlas are just bugged and don't actually connect even though they show that they do. I used to have one ready to show for this, but I've long since lost track of it because honestly the atlas navigation UI just needs a lot of work in general. There can even be maps that are totally impossible to reach from any direction. This one seems like it may have been fixed already, though I haven't seen it mentioned in any patch notes. Early on I noticed that Thawing Charms were just not working at all. I saw that I was getting frozen even though I had a Thawing Charm with full charges equipped, and it was still at full charges while I was frozen. I've tested them again more recently and noticed that they seem to work now, so I'm not sure if this has been fixed or if it's just inconsistent. The rare monster modifier that says it prevents recovery above 50% is bugged and actually prevents recovery above 35%. As it happens, 35% is the exact threshold for low life, so it's obvious what happened here. There is no reason we shouldn't be able to change the reward we take from the Venom quest in Act 3. I was a bit paralyzed on this decision on my first character in Cruel difficulty because one of the options was Chaos Resistance. That's certainly a nice stat, but I wasn't sure yet if I was going Chaos Inoculation, which would make that quest reward choice completely worthless. On the other hand, since I was playing Acolyte of Chayula, it would have been extra efficient to take the Chaos Resistance and then double it through my Ascendancy. That would have been a mistake, however, because I did in fact eventually go CI, and it was at that point, well into endgame, that I finally went back to the Act 3 town and collected my quest reward when I knew I wouldn't need the Chaos Resistance anymore. There is no reason for a quest reward selection to be that complicated, and it wouldn't be if it weren't permanent. Before I finally get into my character, I want to also go over some problems with the current multiplayer system. I don't have any multiplayer footage recorded, so I'm just going to reuse some generic footage here. First, player characters should not have collision with other player characters. This quickly becomes incredibly jarring if there's even a little bit of lag, and it creates opportunities for griefing. PoE2's endgame shares a lot of similarities with Last Epoch, and as such, shares some of the faults in Last Epoch's monolith system. If a player dies in a monolith echo in Last Epoch, they basically have to sit around doing nothing while they wait for the party to finish the rest of the map. The same is true for PoE2 maps. The difference is that monolith echoes take a few minutes at most, but PoE2 maps are huge and can easily be 10+ minute endeavors. This circles back to the need to change the structure of PoE2's endgame, but if that can't be done soon, then something needs to be done to at least smooth out the multiplayer experience in the meantime. So here is the character I started with. It's an Acolyte of Chayula that has gone through many iterations to get to this point, and I still think it's pretty weak overall. Early in the campaign, I switched to Chaos Dot spells like Essence Drain and Contagion, and those felt alright up until about the end of Act 2. By the time I was fighting the literal DPS race boss in Act 3 though, I realized something was wrong, because I was not winning that race. In fact, once I reached this boss in Cruel difficulty with my second character and noticed how much faster I defeated it, I decided to do a little test, which you are seeing right now. I reran both of my characters through this zone, one a level 90 Acolyte of Chayula and the other a level 66 Witch Hunter, to see which character could kill the boss faster. The results were about even, despite a 34 level gap and the advantage of endgame gear on the Acolyte of Chayula. And as it turns out, my Witch Hunter could have done this a lot faster because I didn't yet know about the Barrage Snipe combo, which I could have been using the whole time. Anyway, I managed to stick it out with Chaos Dot spells until I reached endgame, and that's when I grouped with some friends for a couple maps and saw just how monumental the difference in power was between our builds, and I knew I had to change to something else. I know Chaos Dot spells have since been buffed by about 30% since I stopped using them, but I felt like I needed something more like 300% more damage, at least on this class, to be even remotely close to what I was seeing other builds output. I decided to switch to quarterstaff skills with a focus on poison since I could gain some extra chaos damage with my ascendancy. Unfortunately, that limited me to a very few select skills because there just aren't very many attack skills that have a physical or chaos only theme unless you are using a mace or a bow, neither of which appealed to me on a monk. I now realize that using a bow is almost certainly the way to go on this ascendancy, and I will probably head in that direction. But first, I want to go over all the problems I discovered while trying to make a poison quarterstaff build work. The first thing I decided to try was combining Whirling Assault and Staggering Palm, a combination that is literally given as an example in the tutorial videos for these skills.
Whirling Assault deals a lot of small hits and can be redirected as you move. It's very effective when combined with skills that trigger off each attack, such as Staggering Palm.
This iteration of the build was probably the weakest thing I have ever experienced in an ARPG, going all the way back to Diablo 1. Sure, Whirling Assault feels bad to use, is difficult to control, and is barely a shadow of Path of Exile's Cyclone, but Staggering Palm is miserably bad. At first, I thought the skill wasn't even working because I was almost never seeing the buff from it, so I had to reread it. The purpose of Staggering Palm is to grant a buff which makes your other attacks shoot out projectiles. Seems simple enough. But then you realize that it only grants the buff when it stuns an enemy, and this is an unarmed strike that does pathetic damage, so it will never stun unless you do something else to set up a stun first. So let's say you get good at perfectly setting up stuns with your other quarterstaff skills. By the way, this unarmed skill requires a quarterstaff to use, and you think you're about to line up your target perfectly so that Staggering Palm can stun them. Except, you know what else quarterstaffs are really good at? Critting! Quarterstaffs have the highest base crit of any weapon in the game, so they can and will steal away that stun you were trying to set up for Staggering Palm. But let's say you get lucky enough to get the Staggering Palm buff by getting unlucky enough not to crit with your high crit weapon. Congratulations, your attacks now shoot out little projectiles that do pitiful damage, and the buff only lasts for about 10 seconds after you jumped through all those hoops to get it. Something else I just found while editing this video is that you aren't even allowed to keep the buff from Staggering Palm through a weapon swap. I thought I had a clever idea to use a second quarterstaff with a high rolled +2 level of melee skills just for the Staggering Palm buff, and use weapon swap passives to help the unarmed strike hit harder, but it seems like the game is treating the buff like a buff from a combo skill even though it isn't one, so that's not allowed, even if you have a quarterstaff in both of your weapon swaps. Basically, the only viable pure physical quarterstaff skill is Wind Blast, so that's what I'm using as my main attack. There basically aren't any Chaos Quarterstaff skills, despite there being a Chaos Ascendancy for the Quarterstaff class. The only Chaos skills are a utility unarmed strike that applies curses, and a buff that requires combo buildup to provide a mediocre damage boost for a single attack. There isn't a single attack skill that actually uses a quarterstaff to deal chaos damage. I can't really complain about Wind Blast though, it's a pretty decent skill with good range and damage. However, even though the description of the skill specifically says it strikes enemies with a quarterstaff, and it's tagged as a melee skill, it cannot be used to build combo for combo skills because it is not tagged as a strike skill. So that's kind of annoying. I just use the default quarterstaff attack whenever I need to build combo, and I don't feel particularly good about it. I noticed early on while leveling that Bursting Plague feels very good to build around. I was using it with bone spells while I was leveling as a Chaos Dot build, and then just supplementing my damage with bone spells, and using that to tack on some poison, and then getting the Bursting Plague explosions, which just felt really, really good while leveling. So when I switched back to Quarterstaff, I first tried to invest heavily into poison while taking advantage of the mana and energy shield leech from my Ascendancy to keep me sustained. What I quickly realized is that the leech numbers in this game are absolutely pathetic unless you heavily invest in the amount of physical hit damage you are dealing. This meant that I had to move more of my skill tree investment into hit damage and forego a lot of the powerful poison nodes that I would have otherwise wanted. I eventually thought that I found a good balance of hit damage and poison until I took another look around at what other builds were capable of and realized they are still many orders of magnitude stronger than what this character is capable of. But rather than just complain about how weak this Ascendancy is, I want to explain what I think went wrong with the design of this Ascendancy and propose possible solutions. First of all, the darkness nodes are garbage. They have exactly one use case, and I'm pretty sure it's a bug. Taking darkness damage in the Trial of the Sekimas does not count towards your honor meter. Other than that, these nodes are not worth the cost at all. The first notable node in this path removes all spirit. In other words, the cost of going down this path is you are forbidden from using any of the very powerful spirit gems in the game whatsoever. No Grim Feast, no Ghost Dance, no Heralds, you get the idea. The reward for going down this path should be immense, not a pitiful shield and some extra damage that you only gain while the shield remains healthy. I think these are the hardest nodes in the Ascendancy to fix because I think it requires a lot of creativity to come up with a solution that isn't boring like bigger numbers. But if numbers are the way to fix this, then it needs like an extra 0 at the end of the darkness number, not just a little bump. Another possibility could be to allow the character to use a single spirit gem for no cost and massively boost the effect of that gem, but that's just the old Supreme Ego from PoE1. Into the Breach is a cool concept, but it is worthless without the 4-point investment that doubles its effect and duration. This was the first Ascendancy node I took while leveling, and I never once saw the damage buff go above 2 stacks until I got the points to double the duration, and then I could rarely see it go up to 4 or 5. It seems like there isn't even any point in allowing the buff to stack 10 times when it's basically impossible. Either condense the buffs to a lower cap with a higher concentration of power, so like 5 maximum stacks and twice as much damage from each stack, or make the buff duration reset whenever you pick up another purple flame. The blue and red flames, though, are fine. They're welcome and useful, and because they are considered leech, they combo in an interesting way with the nodes that make mana leech instant. And also, I just want to talk about a little bit of math geometry for a second. Generally in this game, you're usually moving in a straight line for the most part. Either you're in a linear map or you are trying to go in a certain direction. You're not just running around in circles, which plays against how Into the Breach works because it places the pickups in a circle radius around you, and they spawn all around you in all directions, and it's kind of an even distribution of where it places them. But because you're generally only moving in one direction, you're actually very unlikely to step on any of them without deliberately seeking them out. They're quite unlikely to spawn in front of you, and you are far more likely to leave them behind in the much bigger part of the circle that you are not actually touching. So since I mentioned the leech nodes, let's talk about them. These should be reversed. The 2-point should be the 4-point, and the 4-point should be the 2-point. And that would immediately fix most of the issues with these points, besides leech being so weak without investing into physical hit damage. The first node of Mana Leech is instant is pretty worthless on its own. No one really cares if Mana Leech is instant as long as it's enough to keep your skills sustained. So there's no reason to ever take this as your first point, and if you path down any of the other directions, you're not really that interested in taking this as a 2-point investment. The notable point behind it, though, is very powerful because it allows your Mana Leech to also keep you alive by restoring energy shield, while also making that restoration instant, and it even makes the blue flames from Into the Breach instantly heal you instead of healing you over time. But doesn't it seem weird to unlock all that power at once behind 4 points, when the first 2 points did basically nothing until then? If these were switched, then you would first unlock Energy Shield Leech as a gradual heal, like a normal leech effect, and turn the blue flames from Into the Breach into gradual healing pickups. And then if you really wanted to crank up that power, you could invest the 4 points to make it all instant. I think this change not only makes the character progression more intuitive, but also fixes a problem in the structure of the entire Ascendancy tree. Right now, the only viable option is to go 4 points deep into the leech nodes, because the last one is the only one that matters, and 4 points deep into the breach, because it just sucks if you don't. And so reality rending just can't ever make the cut. Before I had my 4th Ascendancy, when I only had 6 points to spend, I did have reality rending, but that was only because I didn't have the points to make Into the Breach actually worth taking. With my proposed changes, it would be viable to only go 2 points deep into the leech branch, and then actually decide how you want to spend the remaining points, rather than being pigeonholed. And also with my proposed changes to Into the Breach, you could decide to only go 2 points deep into the breach and actually get some decent benefit out of it. I do think reality rending is actually pretty good, but it just has the issue of competing with 2 different 4-point branches that are not functional if you don't go 4 points deep into them. As for Chayula's gift, I think it's probably fine, but the game just rewards going CI so heavily right now that it's not really taken. If Energy Shield and CI were not so overwhelmingly powerful in the game right now, then this would have more of a place on the tree, and I don't really think it needs to be changed at all. I was originally planning to talk about my other characters as well, but this is already extremely long, and I mainly really wanted to talk about the character I put the most time into while venting my general frustrations with the game. The only thing I'll say about my experiences with other characters is I don't understand the developers' obsession with making skills with a full +1 second to attack time. They invariably feel horrible to use, and no one will ever actually want to use those. I know this video sounded pretty negative overall, but there is still plenty that I love about the game. The boss fights are awesome, and I really hope something like my suggestion to put an optional boss in every map comes to pass. I love Path of Exile, and I have put more time into it than most people put into anything that isn't their job. I want Path of Exile 2 to be a great game that I can also love for many years to come, but right now, it isn't. Thank you so much for watching this far. This script took weeks to write, and I haven't even started recording most of the footage yet while I'm writing this. So hopefully I get this finished and uploaded before GGG completely flips the game on its head and fixes everything I complained about here. Happy New Year! I finished writing this script on New Year's Eve. And stay sane.